So this is actually one of my favorite cards to talk about. I fucks with it. Yeah, I can't pull that off, can I? Anyway, I really do enjoy talking about this card because in a weird way, sort of its journey sort of represents my journey with tarot, or at least how I've come to see it in the world. It's an interesting thing. I'm sure it will come as a surprise to none of you that I rarely read this card as representing sort of feeling trapped or stuck or held in bondage in some way. Now, I think it's valid, and I certainly read it that way for a long time. But I think that there's an interesting journey we can take with this card, which again can just open it up in modern life. And that's not to say, by the way, that feeling trapped or bonded to something in modern life isn't accurate. I think in that regard, sort of common interpretations of this particular card sort of speak to the world maybe more than many others do. It's a very real, practical experience that a lot of folks have. So as always, I don't want to negate what you've got for the card. I just want to share with you some things and some ways of thinking about the card that can open it up for you. And again, the whole point isn't that you agree with me or use everything I'm using in your readings. It's really about helping you take a card apart and understand how it might work in a reading. Like I do with all the cards, I sort of go back to what the card is beyond the image. I try to go back to its title, to its idea. In this case, I did that, but I also went back before the card is what it is. And this card has kind of an interesting journey that I think, I don't know, it really sort of sums up the history of the world in a lot of ways. As we've talked about throughout this series, the cards that we know today as the Trumps emerged out of colonial Christian Europe, and they often depict colonial Christian ideas. But a better way to say that is Christianized, colonialized concepts, because we know that Europe really didn't invent much of anything at that time. They just took what was already there and made it into whatever they wanted it to be. You know, it's pretty well known by historians today that a lot of the holidays that we have around the world in our calendar today, the most common ones that we see, at least here in the United States and Europe, are sort of bastardized versions of festivals and holidays that existed before the Christian religion became so dominant. The church appropriated these holidays partly to lead to conversion, partly to disarm converts, and to give people the festivals that they always had, but sanctioned by the church, and to sort of strip away the old pagan or unchristian aspects of the holidays, of the festivals. You know, we know, for example, I think it's pretty well held by historians that if there was a Jesus, he would not have been born on December 25th. That was just a date around which a lot of worldwide festivals happened to appear, especially those where it would be winter in December. And the church just sort of said, okay, great. In our version of the cycle of the year, Christ is born in winter and he died in spring, and the spring is the resurrection and winter is the promise and all of that stuff. But we know that the holidays in the Christian calendar today were mostly taken from other things. Easter was Ostara, for example. They just took the festivals that people already knew and reappropriated them. And this is relevant to our conversation now because they also did this to deities and gods from other cultures as well. So I'm not an anthropologist, although from watching this series you may assume I think I am. So I can't tell you sort of specifically which deities from pre-Christian became saints and major players in the role of the Christian calendar. But I do know there are some things that were done in order to sort of course correct once people started getting uncomfortable with this very male-centric religion after years and years of more matriarchal religions, or at least sort of partnered religions. You know, one reason why, for example, the Virgin Mary became so powerful an icon in the church was because there was that absence of matriarchal deity. You know, she's not at the same level, of course, as the Trinity, but it was the thing that the church did to sort of course correct the fact that people were missing that vibe. And of course, why wouldn't humans? You know, motherhood is literally the beginning of all life. But note how they took it and sort of desexualized it. Anyway, that's not the point of this. Well, I guess it is. We'll come back to that in a minute. I've also heard that one of the reasons why priests dress the way they do during services is to sort of replicate femininity. I can't say for sure that's true, but you can look at a mass and see costumes and glitz that would rival anything on Drag Race. So the whole point of this is the church took what people knew and over time repurposed it for their own services, repurposed it for their own needs, and to sort of lure people into trusting them or understanding the allegories of Christianity through things they already knew. So like that's a given. The other thing that the church did that was not exclusive to Christianity, but certainly centered in Christianity, was a focus on the binary. You know, there is God and humans, good and bad, saint and sinner, priest and layperson, man and woman. And this became really central to the core of Christianity for some reason. There were many spiritualities or faith traditions prior to the dominance of Christianity that did not center binaries in the same way. There are faith traditions throughout the world where the difference between man and woman was less about binary and more about experience, but also that there were homosexual and genderqueer people in a lot of traditions who were lifted up and celebrated rather than stomped on and pressed on. For many groups, binary didn't exist because life was more nuanced than that. Things aren't just good and bad. Things aren't just good and evil. It's not just heaven and hell. The idea of heaven and hell is particularly Christian, I think. You know, a lot of underworlds that you think about in myth don't have any particular quality other than that they're the underworld. You know what I mean? That it's not so much that good people go here and bad people go there, but that dead people go there. Now, that's not consistent. You know what I mean? This is not a universal thing. Even in sort of mythological underworlds prior to Christianity, you may be segregated by class or life experience, what your job was in the world, and potentially by behavior. And you can think about traditions like Ma'at in Egyptian narrative, where your heart would be weighed. Those things were there, certainly. But the focus on this, like, separation of good and bad was very, very powerfully Christian. So why am I talking about all of this? Yes, it's true, I like to wrestle with the angel and the devil that I grew up with as a faith, but it is relevant to this, because the devil is essentially a Christian construct. Didn't really exist in the same way prior to Christianity, at least, again, not in a super dominant culture. So what does this have to do with the devil card? After all, well, a lot. The devil, as we know it in tarot today, and even in a lot of pop culture, is a Christian construct. It takes older gods and turns it into this one thing that is all bad. But the gods that came before were not entirely good or evil. They were more nuanced than that. They could be as wicked as they were delightful, but that turned into something totally evil in the eyes of the church. And these spirits, these gods, these deities were, of course, the fun ones. These were the gods of wine and music and food and parties and sex, which is all the things that the Catholic Church didn't like and didn't want you to do. Those were the things bad people did. That was for sinners. So if you did those things, and if you engaged with those spirits and deities, you were on a one-way ticket to the bad place.
Holy mother-forking shirt balls.
I think the heaven-hell binary is truly one of the most genius marketing schemes in, like, the history of humanity. Because none of us know for sure what happens when we die, but we're all pretty sure we want it to not be terrible. And so what better way to make money than to convince people you are the gatekeeper to care a lot? So all this is to say that in readings, I try to strip away all of that sort of Christianized lacquer from the card and think about who it was prior to the church shackling it to this evil binary. You know, it's funny, I could have done this whole video without talking about any of that, but there's something really liberating about giving the middle finger to a religion that really fucked me up when I was a kid. When I see this card in a reading, I often see those qualities of those pre-Christian gods, those Pans and Bacchuses, you know, the gods of the harvest, the gods of food and dance and wine and fertility, the gods of excess, you know, the gods of genitals and sweat and sex noises. You know what I mean? I think of pre-Christian humanity and its relationship to pre-binary worlds. I think about how much more nuanced the world was before we were separated into good and evil, good and bad, saint and sinner, heaven and hell. I think about how it's so innate for us to want to have food and sex and wine and music. It's who we are. It's innate to who we are. Of course it is. It's how we make more humanity, and it's also how we survive this fucked up world that we're trying to navigate. So there's something very primal and pure and deeply human, sort of pre-societally human, where we can just be one with the animal that is human. And I think that the card sort of represents that a lot of the time. When I look at the shackled couple on the devil card as we know it today, I don't see people who are chained to a bad situation. I see an orgy. I see people having consensual role-playing. I see something that's happening that's kinky, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, despite the fact that maybe the puritanical dominance of Christianity makes us feel a little weird about talking about that. And I know I talk a lot about sex in these videos, not because I'm a particularly kinky person, I'm pretty vanilla, but the point is that this is part of who we are as humans, and that we have such a, especially in the United States, like a fucked up relationship to that sort of primal essence of desire, you know? And I think you can find it in this card. Once you strip away kind of all of that puritanical sort of sense that sex is evil and that lust is bad and that wanting things, food, music is a sin, you know what I mean? Like, they were created by humans who were supposedly created by the God that wants all these laws. So the idea to me that a God created a humanity to deny itself of all the things God gave it makes no sense to me. So in readings, I think part of this card can represent just being in touch with those more primal parts of ourselves, or, you know, of the need to be, of the need for indulgence in parties and food and music. But I also don't think that's always a good thing, because nothing is all one thing, right? So I talked about this card, you know, related to gods of excess, and I think you can find that here too. You know, overindulgence is a bad thing, you know, and one of the problems that many of us have when we sort of experience the freedom that comes with indulgence is that we sort of want to feel that way all the time. You know, especially for those of us that did grow up in a kind of restrictive religious tradition. You know, in my case, it was the idea of like that who I was attracted to was problematic. And suddenly when I sort of accepted myself for who I was and got out of the grips of that faith, I just sort of, you know, was like, give me everybody, you know what I mean? Just like, I want to be loved by all the men, you know what I mean? And I don't even mean that I had a particularly active, you know, life after coming out, but it was like, I was just desperate for it and I just wanted it. And it became about sort of how many people could I get to like me rather than about finding people I was genuinely connected to. So, you know, I guess the point is, and this is going to sound a little weird, once you sort of lubricate your experience, it's easier to kind of keep going. And that taste of freedom or that taste of indulgence can be hard to stop, and it's easy to go too far. And so I think you can find that in this card too. So while I don't tend to see this card as representing addiction, although that's very common, like I talked about last week with temperance, it's certainly something you could see there. I tend to think of it in its negative sense as sort of overindulgence, you know, and that's a little more general, a little easier to work with. But if you were to pair it with a card like temperance in certain contexts, then maybe it does suggest a problem. You know, on the other hand, those same two cards, depending on the context, could just suggest the need to pull the broom out of your ass and let your hair down. You know what I mean? Because it's all about what we're dealing with. It's all about the other cards. It's all about the question, etc. So temperance has that conservative quality to it. And the devil could be like, let it go. Let your hair down. Relax. Chill. You know what I mean? Go masturbate. Like, you know, you need to de-stress. If this card were paired with something stuffy and uptight like the Emperor, it might suggest the relaxing of rules. And so in that sense, we get the kind of quality of like the Feast of Fools in the old days, where like the poor people would get to be king and all the rules were relaxed. And, you know, it was just sort of, again, kind of a wild bacchanalia for a time immediately before Lent happened and all the rules got incredibly restrictive. I think paired with a card like the Nine of Cups, certainly the devil could represent overindulgence. The Nine of Cups always makes me go, why is this person alone with all these cups? You know what I mean? Like, what's going on there? So I think that that's something, certainly that could be a thing. If you didn't watch the temperance video last week, I recommend doing that, because I did a whole number on talking about substance use in tarot readings and why I talked about it and why I also would be wary about reading on it. So you can just watch that video. Paired with cards like the High Priestess or the Hermit, we could sort of find that pre-Christian, pre-colonial spirituality, those rites, and that connection to sort of what came before we were socialized into this more puritanical, restrictive, patriarchal way of thinking about things, which affects us even if we're not Christian, because certainly in the United States and other nations that sort of have Christianity as foundational to their laws, we're impacted whether we want to or not. Paired with the Hierophant, it could sort of represent exactly what I was talking about earlier, about sort of colonizing and appropriating humanity's innate instinctual spirituality and connection to our bodies to turn it into something rigid. But in another context, it could also suggest sort of those innate spiritual primal qualities trumping the Hierophant. You know, it's going to depend on positioning and, of course, the other cards. For this reason, it's really one of my favorite cards. Like, it's just exciting to read with. The possibilities are really exciting. And I do think that for a lot of us, we've become separated from I'm not suggesting we should be like running naked through the streets and banging everyone we come into contact with, but like to celebrate ourselves, to sort of Walt Whitman our sense of who we are, and to understand that like we don't have to abandon everything in order to reconnect with our deeper humanity and to celebrate, the human body as an experience beyond something that needs to be kind of corseted and hidden from and ashamed of. I think the devil sort of invites that, even though the common perception of the card is that all of that's bad. Another thing that's interesting about this card, or at least the connection that I'm making to it, which sounds really pretentious, but it did make me think of it when I was writing my notes for this, is that white people like me who grew up in a restrictive Christian environment, and I don't mean to say like I was hidden under the stairs like Harry Potter, just like the mores of Christianity as a young queer person, definitely restrictive. When we sort of want to get away from that and explore our own sense of sort of our primal nature, our pre-Christian nature, our deep sort of innate natural spirituality, is that we start to do exactly what the Catholic Church did as it tried to dominate and eventually did dominate a lot of the globe and colonize and appropriate other natural faiths that existed beforehand. By which I mean we take what isn't ours and make it our own. This is a touchy subject in this community, but I'm inviting you to consider a few things. If you are, like me, a white person in the sort of spiritual, I don't consider myself spiritual, but in that tarot world, there's some things to consider. A friend of mine sent me a blog a bunch of years ago, and like many things on the internet, it sort of disappeared. It was a blog post that was about supposedly, Native American tarot decks. And there was a quote that the author had put in from a Native American writer who I can't find because I can't reference the blog post. But what they had written was part of a longer section. It was a quote from a longer piece that this blogger had put in. And I wish I had the lines here because it was so beautifully expressed. But the essence was that, yes, we are the child of peace. We are the child of war and living and dying. And they, colonizers, took that away from us. And now their grandchildren are so spiritually bankrupt, they want to take our beliefs too. And it just was like, fuck, you know what I mean? Like a lot of colonialism that's internalized in us as white people is that like, anything we want can be ours because it's there. And it's, how generous of us to care about sort of indigenous spirituality or West African spirituality or Haitian spirituality. You know what I mean? How generous that I, a white person, am interested in elevating this. But it's not ours. And when we're going and writing books about it or making tarot decks about it or whatever, like we're then capitalizing on it too. And so I think it's worth considering, in this devil card, where we might be doing what the church did in attempting to free ourselves from the church, if that makes sense. I think this is a thing that people in the tarot world, spirituality or whatever you want to call this world in particular, needs to think about as we're trying to sort of free ourselves from, restrictive pasts that we're trying to heal from through like sage and Palo Santo and crystals, and dream catchers. Like, can we reconnect to our innate humanity and spirituality by like mass market buying the spiritual tools of the communities who our ancestors actively tried to tamp down and destroy? You know what I mean? Like, I don't have a good answer for you on that, but I do think it's worth wrestling with. I guess the answer I have for you is that if you do find that those things are necessary, then you should really make sure that you are at least purchasing those tools from the communities who own them historically and benefit from your purchase of them rather than sort of Amazon and Walmart. You know what I mean? Like if you have to have white sage, then get it from a grower who is indigenous. There are folks out there who are making that available. But the other thing I would think about too is like as we kind of try to free ourselves and like connect to sort of pre-Christian spiritualities, is like white sage is becoming endangered because it's being sold at fucking Urban Outfitters now. You know what I mean? So like the consequences of freeing ourselves from Christianity, for example, and then embracing other people's spiritual traditions is actually causing damage to those communities and to the earth. And I don't think that that's a great way to sort of decolonize yourself by colonizing others. So I think that's in this card too. Anyway, it's something that, I just think is worth considering. Like I said, I don't have a good answer for you, and I think if you were to go out into the world and ask different groups, they would give you different answers because communities are not monoliths. But I know for a fact that communities would prefer that you get your supplies from them rather than from superstores. So anyway, that's the devil. So where do you see the devil in modern life? That's a loaded question, isn't it? We'll talk soon. Next week, we're going to look at the tower. Be good, take care, stay healthy, and stay sexy. Why the fuck not?
We've traveled a long distance to see you, oh great one.